What's up, everybody? This is Jason with the Adapted Lens. Thank you for joining me today live. I got some cool stuff to show you today, hopefully. So it is not often that I get to do tutorials, but this has been something I've been playing around with for a little while, and thought y'all would like to see maybe something to add a little bit of extra cool pop to your images. So let's just jump right in. So I got three images to show you today. This is the first of them. This is an airplane. This is a P-51 Mustang. I took it at the tarmac before an air show started. The airplane actually did fly, which was cool to see, and I took some shots of that. But there's an opportunity before air shows, if you've ever been to one, to usually shoot some of the planes sort of sitting there on the tarmac before they take off. This is a plane that my grandfather flew and actually built one in his garage, so it's a little bit of a special connection to me and my family. It's a P-51D, and so I love this image. It's actually a long exposure. You can see the clouds are rather blurred. It was a gray, kind of overcast day, not the best day for air shows, especially in the sky, because obviously they get obscured by the clouds. But I thought this was kind of an interesting way to show motion in a shot with an object that's usually in motion. You know, you think of an airplane always flying, but obviously with it being on the tarmac, I thought using a long exposure would kind of show some motion in the clouds and give it a little bit more of a dynamic feel. And it's a pretty cool shot. I love it. I actually have a copy of this hanging in my bedroom. It's one of my favorites. But there's some things I could do to make it a little bit more interesting. So if you've never used a LUT or a lookup table, some things you can do for color grading that might help your images stand out from the rest. So I was messing around with this a couple of days ago and came up with some ideas that I really liked to make the image feel even just a little bit better. So first off, if you've never used a LUT or lookup table, basically it's just a way for Photoshop to reference colors to another reference. So it's looking up the colors and associating them with different colors. So in this case, I'm going to stack multiple lookup tables on top of each other, and that's kind of a neat feature that you can do in Photoshop. Is you can actually layer lookup tables and incorporate different looks in different parts of your image. So that's kind of what I'm going to be doing here. So the first one I'm going to be adding is the crisp warm look. And now you say, whoa, that's pretty dramatic. Yep, it is. It's definitely not something I would want on the entire image. But the wonderful thing about Photoshop is everything that is a effect filter like this, an adjustment layer, has a mask, and so you can easily just decide exactly where you want the image to show up, or that effect to show up. So in this case, this is actually just going to be used for the tarmac. I kind of like that. It makes the tarmac, in my mind, feel a little wet, and I just kind of like that look, especially because it's cloudy. If you go back, it was a gray, rainy day. We didn't actually get rained on, but it was kind of that threatening all day. So I kind of like the feel of this because it makes the image, the tarmac, feel just a little bit wet. And so a couple things, of course, I think this is a little bit too much, but we'll adjust that after we do our masking. So real simple, I'm going to use my Wacom. If you do not use a tablet, this is, let me just hop back over to full screen real quick. This is a Wacom tablet. This is my Intuos Pro. Basically, it's a substitute for a mouse. If you don't use a Wacom tablet and you're into Photoshop or photo editing or anything like that, you are deeply missing out. It just makes things so much easier. For a couple $100, it really does change the ability that you have in Photoshop. Makes things just so much simpler and easier to use. All right, where did my tablet go? Did it just shut off? It did. There it goes. Of course, it was working until I picked it up. Why are you not on? There we go. See that thing just popped up and said connected. So anyway, I created a layer mask, and basically what I'm going to do, since now I can't get my Wacom to work for whatever reason, it was just working. Let me see if my Bluetooth is not connected. Oh, it says connected, so there it goes. All right, so basically hit B for brush, and I'm going to invert the mask so that it's completely concealed. So Command I to invert. So you see it changed from white to black on the mask, and then I'm going to be painting with white. Just a big soft brush to reveal the mask just on the tarmac. And you don't have to be super duper precise with this. That's kind of the nice thing about, you're just really messing with colors. So it's not something that you have to be absolutely super precise with. So you just kind of quickly go through. And yeah, you could make a selection if you were really trying to be very, very precise on exactly what you were doing. You can make a selection and use that to help make your mask even more precise. And that is something that I'll actually be doing in a different part of this tutorial today. But just, you kind of see, I might actually include this little bit of the runway back here. It is a little bit bright as well. Yeah, so anyway, that is about it for this mask. You can see now, just cleaning up little areas here, under here. And you can take as much time as you need to get this as perfect as you want. If you want to see your mask, you can just option click and see exactly what you're missing. And so this is a good option to kind of go through, and if you've missed areas, you can see that real easily and make sure that your mask is nice and uniform. And that looks pretty good. All right, so here's the difference on and off. It's much more subtle when it's applied to the just to the tarmac, right? But I still think it's a little bit too strong. So I'm going to probably dial it back to maybe 50% on the opacity. Yeah, maybe a little bit more, maybe 65%. All right, so I like that. Next, the sky, I love the sky, but it feels a little bit too cool for me. So I'm going to actually hop on in and add another lookup table. And again, that's one of the really nice things about this is because you're working in layers, really you can add as many of these as you want. And in fact, you can stack them up, you can rearrange them, you can mask out different areas. It's really very flexible. All right, so with this, I'm going to go with late sunset. This is a real dramatic, kind of purpley. And like, whoa, that's intense, right? But again, because it's a mask, it's easy to change exactly what you want to include and what you don't want to include, and it's all opacity affected as well. So one of the other things you can do here is just very much like I just did with the tarmac. I'm just going to invert the mask. There we go. And I'm going to use this to affect my sky. So again, using this to paint. Just zooming through. Again, this one you want to be a little bit more precise with because it is so much more dramatic. So I'm going to take a little bit more time to be extra precise with this. And obviously this is way too much for this image. I mean, you know, this is looking like, you know, end of the world skies, and that's not what we're going for here. We do want to make sure that one thing I just noticed, I was working on a different project and I had my pen pressure opacity set to on. And when you're doing things like this, I tend to actually dislike using opacity flow for when you're painting. I'd prefer to do that all afterwards so that it's a solid mask that is very uniform, and then after the fact, go back through and change the opacity versus allowing the layers to build up. Sometimes when you're doing retouching or something like that, you might want to add a little bit of that pen pressure, but for something like this, I tend to prefer not to. And again, you don't have to be super duper precise here because we won't be using it at this intensity. This is just really, again, I like to paint with in full blast mode, so to speak. I think it just makes it easier to see exactly what you're doing versus, I went a little bit too far right there, versus doing it in layers or building it up over time. Say you were dodging and burning, you might actually want to build it up over time a little bit more. But for this, I just think it's easier to sort of see exactly what you're working on. And then you can always easily erase, which is one of the really nice things about working in layer masks. And because this has got that cockpit kind of clear see-through there, I would include that in the paint job. Because, of course, you're seeing through to the other side of the sky, so you'd want to include that. If you really wanted to, you could actually duplicate this and do maybe a lighter presentation on the plane, so the plane had a little bit of reflection. So that's also an option, just another possibility. But that's why I like working in layer masks like this, because with layers, because you really do have the opportunity to kind of mess with different layers of opacity, or it just does make things a lot nicer and easier. And of course, now that I'm editing this, I see that you didn't really notice it before, but there's a nice little goober right about here from my lens, or from my sensor. If anybody's shot mirrorless cameras, you know that shooting in mirrorless just inevitably means you're going to end up with nastiness on your sensor. There's just nothing in the way to protect you, or to protect it rather, and so you're just going to always end up with schmutz on your lens, or schmutz on your sensor, which is not the most enjoyable thing in the world, because you do have to clean it kind of frequently, or you're doing a lot of touch up. But we'll just go ahead and take care of that real quick. Get rid of that booger. So sometimes I like using that the spot healing brush, but a lot of times I find with complex patterns like this that it just doesn't do the best job in the world. And so in this case, and normally I would be doing this on a separate layer, but this is really just for demonstration purposes. I already actually have a final image of this, but using the actual healing brush tool, not the spot healing brush tool, sometimes does a better job. A lot of times I tell people when I'm doing these kind of trainings that the best thing you can do is just experiment, because sometimes one works better than the other, and there's not always a good reason. So back over here, I saw I just got a little bit too much on the wing here. I'm going to clean that up a little bit. Okay, so that's pretty good. You can see pretty dramatic results, but this isn't where we want it to end up. So again, just going to drop the opacity down a little bit. Another thing you can do, because these are layers, you can actually mess with, instead of messing with opacity, you might want to try a different blend mode. Maybe darken's not too bad. You can do overlay. Or soft light if you want to do something gentle. But in this case, I'm actually going to leave it on just normal and drop the opacity down to, again, maybe 50%. I don't want it to look unrealistic, because it's, excuse me, it's a very realistic photograph of a warbird. So I don't want it to go over the top, but I do want to add a little bit of extra drama into the image itself. Excuse me. And then lastly, the last LUT, and so again, you're using multiple lookup tables, is I'm just going to add fall colors. Kind of gives an overall warm look, you can see, and then again, I'm not going to keep that at 100%. It'll be down to about 50. Just kind of warms it up a little bit. This still feels a little strong. Something like that, maybe. Yeah, that looks good. And then there. All right, so this is where we started and where we went to. I think that's a pretty big dramatic difference. Now, if I spent more time getting the mask perfect, really messing with individual opacity layers and stuff like that, you can get some pretty cool results. But this is just a good example of exactly what you can do with color lookup tables. And so a lot of times I think people come in and they think, oh, I can just add one. So I just did, whatever this is. This is fall colors. So I just did fall colors, and it just added a little extra look to the picture. But I think what you have to remember is that you can really layer these and add some serious drama to your images. So I got two more examples. We'll hop over to something a little bit maybe more common for some folks. This is just a bridal picture. I've already gone through and done my retouch, so it's ready to be graded. So let's go ahead and get out to, if you don't know, the command stroke to zooming out to fill the screen is Command or Control 0, and then Command or Control 1 brings you to 100%. So just really easy, quick keyboard shortcuts to hop you in and out when you're doing things like this. It might help for retouching or anything really. So for this one, it's a portrait. Instead of doing a lookup table, I'm going to do something a little different. So one of the cool things that Photoshop allows you to do is add a gradient map. And so very similar to a lookup table, this assigns color values based on brightness. So it's a cool way to convert to black and white, which is something you can do, but it's not really what I'm here for. So in this case, I'm actually going to hop over to the pastels. So there's a whole bunch of, Photoshop gives you a whole bunch of different gradient options that you can map to. In this case, I'm going to go with something like this, and now you stop and go, what the heck is that? Why would you do that? But again, these are layers, so you can apply blend modes to them. If you were to go with the soft light blend mode, all of a sudden you have kind of this, a little bit more of a dreamy feeling, but you do lose a lot of contrast, right? So I love the colors and the tones that this brings in, but I think it takes out a little bit too much contrast. And so that's a really easy thing to fix. So I'm going to go ahead and add an adjustment layer and pop on a curves adjustment. And with this, I'm just going to add a simple S curve. Something maybe about like that. So that kind of takes the contrast back in. So if you look at the before and after, it kind of keeps the contrast similar, but just adds a nice little pop of color. And I think that's maybe a little bit too much, so I'll drop it down a little bit, maybe around 80%. We'll see what that looks like. And then because I'm not using so much of the effect, I can probably drop the opacity on the curves layer as well. Yeah, that looks good. So it's a really simple little way to add an overall color effect, and you can really spend a lot of time. In fact, I might do another tutorial on using inspiration for color palettes. So you can actually, if you wanted to, you could hop over into Unsplash or another photo sharing site, download an image where you love the color palette, and actually create a color palette that matches your favorite image to apply to the images that you create. So by using this gradient map, you can actually recolor your images to match something that you feel inspired by. So whatever that might be, if you're doing something like a portrait or a landscape shot. So it's a really cool way to match colors to images that you're inspired by, or just add a little bit of something extra to the images that you're working on. So I really like this. And then one thing that I always tend to do for my images, I think it was Ansel Adams that said that an image is not finished until you've darkened the edges. So a really easy way to add a simple vignette to your images. And I like doing it this way versus going in and hand painting the edges, because it gives you a lot of control, is just create another curves layer. And then at the intersection here, just drop the levels kind of low, somewhere around there. Right? And then again, because you have a layer mask, real simple, just take a brush and make it nice and big. Something like that. And then just nice and soft. So it's hardness set to 0. And it just bring up the brush size. And the idea here is that you can just basically tap in the areas you want. I don't know why it keeps jumping to 4800. That is a weird, like, Photoshop glitch or something. I don't know. Anyway, it goes from 3000 to like 4800. It's really weird. Anyway, real simple. You can just sort of tap in the areas you want to reveal a little bit of extra light. And then what you're doing is you're basically removing that curves adjustment from the edges, or from the center. So here's the before, and here's the after. and it's probably a little bit much. So we're going to drop down the opacity a little bit. And you can see on my mask, because it was being not nice to me, which happens every once in a while, I overpainted the edges a little bit. So I'll just repaint in that mask a little bit. But anyway, that's just another way to add a vignette, just another simple way to add a vignette. So we'll take a look at the before and after on this. And of course, this also is turning off my retouch. So if you wanted to see the retouch, so that's the original image, then there's my retouch, and then there's all the effects. So again, I feel like maybe the pinks are just a little strong, so maybe drop it down a little bit more. And because I dropped it down, I'll also drop down the S-curve opacity, because I don't want it to be too contrasty of an image. The vignette still looks pretty good, except for some reason it's being nasty with me about this. It's just being a little laggy. I think it's because I'm probably running a live stream at the same time as I'm trying to paint and everything else. So it's just probably a little bit too much, a little too much for my computer to handle. But there we go. I'll just paint it in with my mouse. But this gives you a tremendous, doing a vignette this way gives you a tremendous amount of control. So let's just delete the layer mask real quick and create a new one. So here's the layer mask all over again, right? Say you just wanted to leave the vignette off her face, right? So you can actually just go in here and just paint there and make that 100% transparent. So there's no vignette applied whatsoever to her face. See? And then you can, with lowering the flow of your brush, say down to 30 or 40%, you can then go back in and paint a little bit more light into her dress. And what this does is gives you a lot more control than just using, say, Lightroom to add a vignette where it's just going to be all solid, darkening the edges or brightening the edges. So I really like adding the vignettes in Photoshop. I just think it gives you a little bit more control. It's really simple to do with a curves adjustment. There's a lot of other ways you can do it, but this is just a way I tend to like to do. I feel like it does a nice result, and because it's paintable, it really does give you a lot of control, which I think is nice. So here's the beginning of the before and afters. I just really like that sort of slight pinkish hue, and we might even drop this down a little bit more. You don't want it to be. The idea really isn't about making it look ridiculously different. The idea is really about making it look slightly different, and enjoying the benefits of just simple color grade, but without. You don't want to smack your audience or the viewer or your bride or whatever, your client, between the eyes and say, I made the changes to this. I made this look weird. Everything has to be subtle. So I think this is a nice little subtle effect. So that's just a simple little tip there. And that's not using a lookup table. That's using a gradient map. Cool thing about Photoshop, and we'll do this last one here, is that you can actually combine them to get different results as well. So this is a picture of Turret Arch. I took this a couple of years ago when my wife and I were down in Moab. If you've not been to Arches National Park or Canyonlands National Park, just definitely make it on a list of your trip. It's incredible out there. I love it. This was a sunrise shot. It's pretty funny because the sun is actually rising behind me, but behind me was about 300 other people trying to take a picture and doing other things that were in the way. And the sun didn't rise where I wanted it to, or wasn't rising where I wanted it to. But if I turned around, all of a sudden there's this beautiful rock formation and there was nobody there. So it was a really great opportunity to shoot kind of a really prominent monument there at Arches National Park, but with seriously nobody around at all. So this is one of my favorite pictures. Again, this is hanging on the wall at my house. So this is pretty easy. We're going to go ahead and hop into lookup tables. But before we do that, I'm actually going to make a selection. So this is a case where I really want to be more precise instead of blending, because I do have kind of a complicated edge here. I could take the time to paint this, but it's easy enough to do a selection. So I'm just going to grab this quick selection tool and just zoom through making a selection here. Real simple. Again, doesn't have to be the most precise selection in the world, although in this case I would consider probably a little bit more of a precise selection. Just just for a better end result. And I won't spend a ton of time doing this. I'm assuming if you're watching this, you know how to do a somewhat of a selection. Well, I'll refine the edge here and just make it good looking. Yeah, it's easy enough. And Photoshop does such a good job these days with edge selections, that especially on an image like this where there's such a difference in the contrast and the color range of the sky and the foreground, that it really does do a fairly good job. The idea here, though, is really to make sure you do a decent selection, because what you don't want is any haloing. It would look funky if you did that. So I noticed I did not select here, so I'm going to just go ahead and remove this area here. There we go. Just real quick. Paint that out. Okay. And that looks pretty good. So there's my selection. Now I'm not going to be applying this to the rocks initially. My first effect is actually going to be on the sky. So since I selected the rocks, I have to invert my selection to select the sky. And that should look pretty good. Next step is to get my lookup table, and in this case I want to add a late sunset. Again, I like the color palette of this for whatever reason. I just think it looks cool on some images. Again, way over the top is just insane, but you can see here, had I not taken just a little bit of time to brush this out with all these little things sticking up every which way, it wouldn't have looked quite as nice and neat. And I can still see there's some nastiness here that if I spend a little bit more time on the mask, it wouldn't have shown up. But this is just a good idea. So you can see pretty dramatic. And now we're not doing a sunset. This is a sunrise. So it's not perfect, but there's some things you can do to tweak it, including dealing with the opacity, et cetera, et cetera. But instead of doing that, the next thing we're going to do, and we'll blend it once we're finished, is actually going to add a gradient to the ground. So hop back in here, and we're going to add a gradient map, and not black and white. We're going to go and look for something in the orange palette, because that was something that struck me about being out that way, was just how incredibly reddish orange the ground and everything was. It was just, it's really cool to see. Like I said, if you've not been out that way, it's a really cool place. All right, so here I'm just going to mess with my colors a little bit. So if you've done any gradient work in Photoshop, this is exactly the same thing. So I want to add, instead of it being quite so red, I just kind of want to have like a little bit of a darker brown there. And then it wasn't yellow, it was really more orange. So again, just going to move my color tones to orange. And the nice thing is you can add as many colors in between your darkest value and your lightest value here. So you can add different tones. If you need it to be a little bit more precise, you can do that. For the sake of time, I'm just going to have 2. But there is really an infinite amount of control you have over your color palette, which I think is really cool. That was right. Okay, so again, way crazy, which obviously is not what we're going for here. So let me go ahead and delete this layer mask, and I am going to duplicate the layer mask. So now if you've never duplicated a layer mask, you just hold Alt or Option and click and drag up, and you can duplicate the exact layer mask. Now, the difference is of course, this one was designed, the color lookup table was designed to mask the sky, whereas this one was designed to mask the ground. So I'm just going to invert that mask, and boom, good to go. There it is. So that's a really cool, easy way to make your masks over and over again, instead of having to go through the whole process of selecting and all that. So there you go. That's like, holy crap, over the top. It's not something I would ever be proud of, but we're getting there, right? So the first thing I want to do is take down, and I always encourage you, if you're considering this, play with the blend modes a little bit, and sometimes you'll find a result that you weren't necessarily expecting, but that really does give you a cool image. So again, I kind of liked the look of Lighten. It kind of just adds a little bit of a purple hue without being over the top, which I really like that look, although it's not quite as strong as I want. Now, one thing you can easily do is just duplicate the layer and it becomes a little bit stronger. But kind of what's cool is if you look back here in the distance, this canyon back here is kind of have that, because it's getting illuminated. It has kind of a little bit more of a purple light to it, whereas this was in life really very red-orange. But by adding this, you kind of blend a little bit of that color with the canyon in the background. So I really like that. It's kind of a neat little palette. I might add a little bit of contrast to it. I might darken it a little bit. We can get to that here in a minute. But then the other thing I'm going to do, this is just a little bit too, see the difference there? It's just a little too orange. It's just too much, right? So simple enough. I'm going to mess with the blend modes again just to see if there's anything I like. I know there's probably a scientific method here to finding the blend mode that you want right out of the gate, but I don't tend to be that precise with things. I just sort of play. And so sometimes, photography is about being precise, but I also think sometimes photography is about having fun. And so for me, I'd rather just have a good time. And so here I'm just going to drop down the opacity a little bit and right about there. That looks pretty good. Yeah, see, it's just adding just a little bit of those orangey red overtones to the image. It really was shocking, especially coming from Florida where everything is just sand, to see that bright, kind of crimson colored clay or whatever the dirt is. It's just beautiful out that way. So I wanted to accentuate that in my image. So that looks pretty good. You can see there's the before and after. So pretty simple, very effective, I think, way to add a little bit of drama. And like I said, one of the things we can do is just add a simple layer to another layer for a gradient. So just adding a layer here, and we're going to go to the gradient tool, and I'm just going to drop a gradient down on there. Not that hard. Something maybe like that. There we go. And I'm just going to drop what am I doing here? Something like about there, and way too much. So again, just sort of dropping that gradient, something like that. Just kind of adds a little bit of darken to the sky and lightens the foreground just a little bit, which I kind of like. Now, if you don't want to lighten the foreground, if you wanted to just mess with the sky itself, easy enough to do. Change your gradient from black to white, make it black to transparent instead. So drop your opacity to 0, hit OK, do the same thing, change your blend mode. Now it's not affecting the ground, it's just affecting the sky, right? So that's super easy. You can, again, drop the opacity a little bit. And if you really wanted to get fancy and you don't want it to affect the actual arch and you really want it to affect just the sky, you can actually just simply, again, copy the layer mask. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. Copy your layer mask up 1, right? So why did it not do that? It's harder to do this when you're not looking at your keyboard. All right, there we go. So now that is only affecting the sky portion because I have a layer mask on the image. It is no longer affecting the ground. Easy way to do it, no big deal, super simple. There's the gradient, right? There's my ground. Very subtle, not hard. I don't like, big sweeping hard edits. In fact, this gradient is way too harsh. I'm really more into subtle, so that's a little better. But by adding the lookup tables here and actually duplicating them, it takes away that blue, which doesn't really say sunrise to me. It's not, and it's because I was looking the other direction and I kind of missed that early morning color. But I still want to replicate that. So by adding a little bit of pink hue to the sky, and you can choose, I think probably 1 is enough. I really don't think I need 2, but by adding that plus the gradient there, and then adding a little bit of oranges and reds to the foreground, I think it really makes a nice image that kind of comes together. It tells the story of the morning, and I think that's what you have to remember, is that so often photography, we get caught up in making sure that the image is technically perfect and sharp and all that other things. But remember, you're telling a story about a moment in time, and if the viewer isn't there, they don't know what you felt or experienced. So it's really important, especially with digital being so easy to be overly precise and get caught up in the moment of sharpness and megapixels and all these other things, that you want to be able to tell the story of why you were there, what made it special. And also you want to tell the viewer that not only am I there, but you should want to be there, right? So sometimes that doesn't mean being super technical about colors. I don't ever want to go to a landscape shot and hold up a passport and make sure that my passport color checker to check my colors to make sure that the red that I'm putting in my image is exactly the red that I saw at that moment. I just don't think it's that necessary. Now, if you're doing product photography or anything like that, commercial photography, that's a whole different conversation. You don't want Coke red to be the wrong red kind of thing. That's a whole different conversation. But this is, landscape photography, even portrait photography, it's a little more subjective. And so you have the opportunity to be free and experiment a little bit. And remember that it's telling a story. It's not necessarily about super perfection, right? So I clicked the wrong button, of course, but I just want to hop in here, last little look, and just show you the difference. This is the turret arch before and after, right? So just a little more subtle colors. I love the final look of this. The bride, again, just sort of subtle, adds a little bit of that warmth, and I think beautiful. Remember, it's all about being a little soft and beautiful, especially depending on the bride. This bride was very feminine, and her favorite color is pink, so I think that was probably a good fit for her. But there's lots of ways you can go with this, and just experiment, play around, right? And then this P51 shot, I really think that this was a big improvement. This feels very cold, and it was a rainy kind of, like I said, but adding just that little extra oomph to the picture, I think makes a huge difference. It kind of adds some drama. So anyway, with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I'm going to call it a day for that, and hopefully you'll like, comment, share, subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me what you're doing with color lookups or grading. Tell me how you've used this information to maybe make some more creative images. I'd love to see them. So anyway, bye for now, and I will talk to you again soon.